And look, number three, probably empathy, empathetic. This also is a big one for me. So someone takes a photo of the receipt and automatically extracting the relevant details from it to complete the expense report. So think of it, things like GST, the account code, even things like the description. With the state of language models today, we're able to pull all of that out with I think the biggest risk right now is actually being left behind. And as the technology advances, the individual and the organization falls behind. And I think if you fall behind, those risks that you just shared actually become much more pronounced. So,
hello and welcome to CFO Forum Australia. I'm your host, Amit Arora. In my day job, I work with CFOs to uncover funds in their cost base and unlock capital for the projects they care most about. Being a CFO isn't just about the numbers. It's about trust, clarity, and leading teams through change, especially in fast-moving sectors like Fintech. Today, I'm joined by Damon Hauenstein, CFO and COO at Wheel, whose career spans investment banking and now leadership at one of Australia's fastest growing B2B fintechs. Together, we'll cut through the noise and get to the human reality. How do finance leaders actually drive impact when every dollar and every minute counts? Welcome to the show, Damon.
thanks for having me, Amit. Looking forward to it. Love what you've been doing with these sessions and bringing ideas and insights to finance leaders, and great to be able to share a few things from my perspective.
Thank you, Damon. It's a pleasure to have you here. You started in investment banking, and now you're both CFO and COO at a high-growth fintech. What drew you into this world, and what was the most daunting moment of that transition?
Yeah, today, CFO and COO at Wheel, fast-growing finance technology spend management company, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. My background, studied law, commerce, joined Citigroup as a graduate in their investment banking M&A advisory team, and spent just over a decade working with boards, CEOs, CFOs on transformative strategic initiatives for their organization. So really, working with those leaders on what was generally the most material and significant project they were undertaking at the time, and therefore a lot of focus and rigor around that. So did that for as I said, just over a decade. Loved it, got to work with a whole range of interesting companies and industries, but found myself yearning for something a little bit more on the principal side. So working with a company and seeing some of those decisions through end to end rather than just advising outside in a professional services context. So look, I met a number of companies across a range of industries, and through that journey of discovery, landed on the two founders of Wheel, which was then known as DiviPay. They were doing something that really resonated with me. They were automating expense management and making life easier for CFOs and finance leaders. It was a world I understood from my time at Citi, and I thought they had a really great solution to that pain point and to that problem. They were looking, on their side, they were looking for a first finance hire. They didn't have anyone in the finance function. So there was a good chemistry and meeting of the minds there. And so, look, I joined, spent the first part of my tenure really just setting up all the core finance systems and infrastructure so that the business could run efficiently. Shortly after that, once a lot of those foundational things were set up, we brought on board a great financial controller that helped me with a lot of those pieces as well. And then the later part of my time really just helping the founders across the organization solve problems as they come up, just being a bit of a generalist in that regard. Wherever there was a tricky problem or a thorny issue, just helping work through it and being a bit of a partner and sounding board to the founders across the organization. So more recently, I've picked up the COO role as well, which I think was really just a recognition that I was doing a lot of work outside of the traditional finance disciplines. And that brings us to today, really. So just over 4 years into my time at Wheel, the business is growing rapidly. Still, we're embarking on all sorts of exciting things and still loving the journey.
Yep. And, moving from a well-established investment banking firm to a fintech startup, that's quite a change. That's a huge change, in fact. What was the most daunting part of that transition?
Well, if you meet investment bankers, most of them will tell you when you move from investment banking to another field, most of their friends, most of their family, most of their colleagues encourage them to do it and think it's a welcome change. So look, I wasn't too different in that regard. Had things that I was looking to achieve, Amit, outside of what I was doing at City. I love what I was doing there, but was just looking for something new and different. Spent a lot of time talking to different businesses and really honing into what I was looking for next. And for me, that was a company that was growing and a company that was in the technology space. That's kind of where I started to narrow into with the discussions I was having at the time. So actually, when the Wheel opportunity came up, I was already very clear what I was looking for in the next role, which made that discussion quite easy.
Great. Now, the CFO role I've also heard can be isolating. Can you share a time at Wheel or previously in your career when you felt the weight of a decision resting entirely on your shoulders, and how did you handle it?
Yeah, so when I joined Wheel, it was probably best characterized as a startup. And by a startup, I mean the business was burning money in the sense that it was spending, each year it was negative cash flow, which meant as the CFO, I felt this enormous responsibility initially just to make sure the business didn't run out of money. Now, business only runs out of money once and then it ceases to exist usually. So I think I felt a big load myself to make sure to our employees, to our investors, that the business was on a good financial footing and on a trajectory to be cash flow positive and ultimately profitable. I think for the first period, that was harder. And, I joined in 2021, so kind of in a lot of ways top of the market for a lot of fintech in companies such as us. And at a time where there was a lot of encouragement from the market, the investor community, to spend money as quickly as possible and go out and raise again. And I think in that context, I felt an obligation to make sure that even if we were spending money to grow, which we were, it was always with a view to get the business to cash flow break even and ultimately profitability. And look, we've now kind of crossed that divide. I'd now characterize us as a scale-up business that is cash flow break even and going on positive. But I think the earlier days of that journey, certainly it felt like a lot of burden on the CFO role to get the business through that period.
So here's a quick fire question for you. If you had to describe your leadership style in just 3 words, what would they be and why?
And why? Okay, well, look, 3 words. I think I'm pretty driven. I think perhaps comes from an investment banking background, but I think I've always been very ambitious and driven in what I am putting my mind to do. I think if I'm doing something, I want to do it to the best of my ability. So that'd be the first one. Second, I'd probably say approachable. I think a lot of what I can bring to the organization, to the community, like the finance community, is giving back things that I have heard because people have taken the time to share those things with me. So I think being approachable, that others feel comfortable to come up and share things with you, I think is has been a huge asset and something that I really continue to focus on. And look, number 3, probably empathy, empathetic. This also is a big one for me. I think as a finance leader, as a CFO, you end up having such wide context across the organization because you're involved in so many discussions and you kind of become a bit of a central repository for a lot of organizational knowledge. And one thing I've certainly found is as you work with leaders across different functions, just understanding their role, understanding the unique challenges and constraints that go along with other roles is huge to building bridges and building trust with those other groups. And I think as a CFO, it's hard to succeed in the role without strong relationships across the different functional areas because so much of the role is aligning stakeholders and aligning budgets and aligning forecasts. So yeah, that empathy has been a big one for me, and that might look like spending time doing that role. If you think about a sales function, spending time doing customer calls so that you understand that role. If it's support, spending time doing support tickets and calls so that you understand that role. I think those little steps can have a huge impact on your ability to contribute to the organization.
Great. No, it's very inspiring. We'll change gears here and we'll move into spend management in the real world. Before we do that, let me provide a little introduction for our viewers. It is often described as a spend management platform, but those words can sound technical. For most finance leaders, the real questions are about control, trust, and making processes less painful. With that, what's the problem behind the problem that Wheel is really trying to solve for CFOs and finance team?
Yeah, so look, I mean, if you look at any business across the market, they all spend money as part of their operations. But spending money means that has to find its way back to accounting systems and reporting and regulatory bodies like tax agencies. And therefore, often spending the money is the easy bit, but actually getting it all ready for the finance systems is the hard bit. So what do? We basically make it easy for businesses to spend money, to make payments without friction, and then capture all those details to complete the expense seamlessly. So if we're doing our job well, finance team members should not be spending long periods of time collecting receipts, coding receipts. What they should be doing is freeing themselves up to do much more value additive tasks across the organization. So that's our job. Help businesses get all their expenses complete and help everyone in the company have the ability to spend money without increasing the risk to the organization.
I get that. Now, when a business gets spend management right, what does that actually look like in practice? Could you give an example or a story from, let's say, your customers without naming names?
Yeah, look, I mean, the great thing is the customers that we have love the product, which has been a really rewarding thing for me in my time at the organization. So what does it look like when you get it right? We had a customer just last week that came along to our company strategy day just to share some of their experiences with Wheel. So maybe if I just recount what was shared in that. Prior to implementing Wheel, the finance team was spending 2 weeks at the end of each month collecting receipts and coding receipts. So 2 weeks of the month was spent closing the books every month. So almost half of one's year spent on those tasks. They rolled out Wheel across their organization. They've now got that down to 4 days. So from 10 days to 4 days. So 60% reduction in the time it takes them to close their books. And how is that achieved, or what is sort of the magic that is enabled that? When they use Wheel, they are able to automate the collection of receipts from their team members team members are automatically prompted after they make a transaction to provide the details. In parallel with that, we've got AI agents now across the product that are automatically looking at the receipt once it's been uploaded. So someone takes a photo of the receipt and automatically extracting the relevant details from it to complete the expense report. So think of it, things like GST, the account code, even things like the description. With the state of language models today, we're able to pull all of that out with AI. So if you're an employee, your experience is pretty simple. You're taking a photo of the receipt. The AI will then populate the fields for you, and your role just becomes checking to make sure it's accurate and hitting the submit button. Therefore, when you're sitting in the finance function, by the end of the month, you've actually got almost all of your receipts and expenses already completed, and therefore you're able to close the book so much faster. So that customer that I shared, 6 days a month, they're now getting back to focus on the more strategic side of the finance function, getting involved in things like planning and forecasting and M&A, working as a partner with the CEO instead of spending their time sending emails, phoning employees, chasing them to upload receipts. So I think when it's done right, it can have a huge impact on the productivity of the finance team, but also the experience of the whole organization around expenses generally.
And how do you measure, as a CFO, the real value or the hard dollar impact of a platform like Wheel?
Look, there's a few ways you can look at it. One of the simplest ways I often think is just how many hours have been saved. So you can look at that through two limbs. One is you can look at how much time are you saving for the employees that submit expenses, and each of them is saving a couple of hours a month, then you're already getting into the hundreds of hours saved on the employees alone. And then when you come across to the finance team, so your CFO and the rest of the team that make that up, again, you can do a similar analysis and look at, well, how many hours that were previously tied up in expense processes and approvals and checking details and sending them back have now been freed up. You might get hundreds of hours on that side of the ledger as well. And look, at that point, you can really just multiply it by your average hourly wage and get a pretty good proxy for how much the organization has freed up to go and spend on, to go and like that time can now be invested in other important tasks across the organization. So look, that's generally the framework that we think about. That's generally the framework that our customers think about it. We find it's a pretty easy discussion, admit, to have with finance leaders, because we generally sell to finance leaders. So that framework becomes pretty intuitive to most people. And as I mentioned before, lots of customers have successfully implemented this process and got the results. You know, when we find new prospects that are interested, we've always got lots of case studies and lots of customers that are happy to act as advocates on our behalf to share the positive experience they have had with other customers.
And do you also meet clients or prospects who are skeptical about ROI? Did you get a pushback? How did you respond to it? And what did you learn from that exchange, really?
Yeah. Look, most of the interest we get today is inbound. And most of it has come from someone that has had a conversation with someone else that has implemented Wheel successfully or loved it in their organization, has encouraged someone else to look at it. Or the other common route is someone has actually implemented Wheel successfully in their prior organization, and they go to a new organization and they say, what are we doing here? This is a pretty archaic way of doing things, and they bring Wheel across. So look, we don't have a lot of customers and prospects that are challenging us on that part. And it's generally the case that customers are coming in looking to understand what we do and how it works. And yeah, most customers, that saving is quite intuitive to them, so they're probably not doing the detailed analysis. But I think those that those that do the maths find that it very, very quickly covers the outlay for the software subscription.
And you talked about AI agents with automation and AI now kind of embedded into finance platforms. Where do you see the biggest risk for CFOs? Is it losing oversight, staff disengagement, or is it something else?
Well, look, I think today, as we sit here, 2026, and this stuff changes so quickly. But I actually think today the biggest risk for people is actually not experimenting and not exploring with these tools. I think when I go out and talk to finance leaders, I am often surprised how many organizations are still a little bit hesitant about leaning into the trend, be that because of data security concerns, be that because of lack of technical familiarity or fluency in the organization, or just lack of leadership pushing it. So look, if as a CFO today, I would be strongly encouraging anyone to be leaning into this and experimenting with it. I think the biggest risk right now is actually being left behind. And as the technology advances, the individual and the organization falls behind. And I think if you fall behind, those risks that you just shared actually become much more pronounced. So staff disengagement, I think, is relevant, because if you're not showing an understanding of it and experimenting with it, I think it then causes staff to say, well, what is our future in this new world? I think the oversight piece, again, if you're not experimenting and leaning into it today, then it's hard to understand how you can effectively apply that oversight in the future. So yeah, that would be a big message on that, is just lean in and experiment, because everything is changing so quickly and so rapidly in this space.
I've also heard some people say that too much automation erodes financial discipline. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, I think the thing not to lose sight of is there is still a huge human element in an AI era. So I think particularly for CFOs and finance leaders, so much of their value add in the organization is actually the trust and human relationships with others in the organization. And I think that is actually how a lot of them will add value. So look, I think automation is fantastic for freeing up time to focus on more strategic pieces. And I think those more strategic pieces ultimately unlock you to go and build better relationships, unlock you to go and have better human conversations, and unlock you to go and do more analysis on the data. I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive. I think you can have a really strong core set of automations and finance systems that provide the base for you and the finance team, and then use that capacity that's been unlocked to really go forth and drive much more strategic human-to-human conversations across the organization.
One shift you believe will define the CFO role in the next 5 years?
Well, look, I would say, Amit, it's AI. And look, you probably would struggle to find someone that wouldn't share that at the moment. But I think it's just such a huge change for industries globally. And I think the finance function is naturally going to change along with other industries. I think finance has been a little bit of a laggard in terms of its adoption of AI tools, in terms of capabilities around this. So, if you think about the earlier iterations of the models, they really struggled with numbers. It was like their Achilles heel for the first couple of years. And I think a lot of numerical people become a little bit skeptical about how much of an impact it would have in their role, in their domain. I think that's changed so quickly. Today, we have got models that are pretty universally accurate around numbers. We've got models that are competing at prize-winning standards in international math Olympiads and really pushing the cutting edge on math. So I think that legacy has shifted. And look, as we sit here today, it's easy to forget that it's only a couple of years ago that all of this technology started to emerge. ChatGPT launched late 2022. And in that time, we've gone from simple chatbots to reasoning models, to multimedia models, to agentic models that can operate for short tasks, to now we're talking about agentic workflows that can operate over long tasks. That's just in a few years. So if you follow that pace of change in that short period of time, it's huge. And if that trajectory continues even at a fraction of the current pace, it's going to unlock so much. And for finance specifically, I think it's really started to pick up pace the last few months. So Anthropic in particular has really been pushing hard on the finance function. They've put a lot of research into this. Some of their new functionality, Claude for Excel, Claude Code, and now Claude Cowork, really starting to make big strides. So I think the finance role, the CFO role, is really going to be defined in the next few years by people's ability to master these new tools and integrate them with the organization. I think that will be the big skill that everyone is looking for.
And if you could give a single piece of advice to an upcoming finance leader about building resilience and avoiding burnout, what would that be?
Yeah, so look, I think this is a real issue, Amit, and the finance role, even at the senior levels, can often feel quite lonely and isolating. So look, the piece of advice I would share is go and speak to peers. That would be my big message. I think a lot of the work that's done in the finance function is function specific. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of tasks you will do as a finance leader that you are probably the only one doing them or thinking about them in the organization. But if it's function specific within the company, when you go outside of the company, it's actually amazing how industry agnostic the finance role can be. What I mean by that is, I work in a Fintech company. I can go and talk to a CFO that manufactures widgets, and we will be in sync from the outset because the challenges he or she is facing in that role are often very similar to the challenges that I'm facing in my role. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, you've still got to contend with things like payroll, regulation, treasury, debits, credits, audits. And I think on a similar thread to that, I found people are so generous with their time when asked for help. So if you had the opportunity to meet with other peers in the finance industry at events or finding them on LinkedIn or through mutual connections, I would encourage people just to ask them for a coffee. And I think many people would be surprised how responsive others in the finance community are to doing that. And I think that is a great way to share some of the challenges and pain points you have in your role and see and learn how others are solving them, because everyone's got their challenges. No one has all of the answers.
And if you were to reflect on what's the legacy that you hope to leave at Wheel and in the broader finance community, what would you say?
Well, look, let me answer that as an organization, as an individual. So look, I think Wheel as a business, the legacy we would like to leave is just making finance teams feel superhuman. So freeing them up from the repetitive, less exciting parts of their role to go forth and conquer and embrace the more strategic, value additive and exciting parts of their role. So that's what we're trying to do as Wheel. That's the legacy we would like to leave, make finance teams feel superhuman. And look, for me, on an individual level, Amit, I would like to share learnings and help finance leaders solve problems. That's what I did for my decade at Citi. It was work with finance leaders and finance teams to solve problems, share learnings and insights from other companies that I covered and other colleagues across the Citi global network. And I feel, at Wheel, I'm carrying the torch and doing a similar thing on that front. So I have the privilege of meeting with and speaking with hundreds of CFOs. And I think the best thing I can do is just share some of the most interesting and insightful things that are shared with me, with others. And what we're doing here today, Amit, is a great example of that. Just an opportunity to give back and share some of the things that I have heard and learned along the way. So that would be the legacy on an individual level.
You're clearly a man on the mission, Damon, and it was a pleasure having you on the show. It was very insightful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you for everything you're doing to give back to the community and putting this together. Thank you.
Great. Talk to you soon.